change and cannabis,
Right.
if you can believe it. But that is a subject near and dear to both of our hearts. And I've gotten to know her through Clubhouse. She she co-administrates the Climate Crisis Club, which is the largest of the climate clubs on Clubhouse. And she's kind enough to bring me in as co-admin. So you'll often see us, particularly Sundays at 3 o'clock on Clubhouse Eastern Time, 3 o'clock Eastern Time. We do our room. But I'm very excited for Sweta to. You're in for a real treat here. She's got a very successful TED Talk, and she's really rising fast in this world. So I think we can you can take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and to Kiki for inviting me to contribute to this. This really resonated with me because I have realized since getting into climate change that the innovative solutions that are going to solve this crisis are going to require that we break down our silos and really collaborate across disciplines. And it was really interesting joining Clubhouse initially as one of the first scientists, I think, truly, that joined. This was back in October of last year. And there were so many creatives on Clubhouse at the time. It was media and a lot of influencers that I was trying to find a common thread. And it became, now looking back, it's so clear that that's where real just ingenuity and creativity and diversity of thought comes from. And that's when you actually start to kind of pick each other's brains across different disciplines and expertise, that you develop what is going to be really required in terms of creative solutions to confront the climate crisis. So when Kiki told me about this, I was really excited because this is a real world application of a lot of abstract thought of, can we actually figure out ways to find efforts across artists and musical theater even, and how is that relevant for advancing science and technology and innovation? And I think somebody like Joe is very well positioned at the intersection of all of that. And increasingly so am I. I really appreciate and recognize how much, whatever your craft is, whether you're in art, fashion, music, entertainment, there is a role to be played in addressing some of the biggest global crises that we face as a global collective. And it's everybody's responsibility, because ultimately there's nothing we're going to be able to do if we don't have an environment that we can actually operate in. So I think the subtext behind whatever it is that we're interested in, we're passionate about, and we're pursuing, is ensuring that there's an environment where we can really do that and do that well. So that's what drives me, and that's what really attracted me to this effort. And what I think would be helpful in the time that I've been allotted is to give you a little background into what behavioral science is, because if you're working in your craft, in your space, it's not something you're going to, oh, sorry, hold on. Can you hear me? Sorry. I have this like really.
We could hear you before, but try again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I'm getting rid of my fancy mic. That happens sometimes. I think it would be really helpful to give some behavioral science background, and to, as I'm talking through what behavioral science is, to see how it applies to the work that you're doing. And feel free to then come up with any questions, and I can address that at the end. But this is a field that is really underutilized and has a lot of applications across a lot of different areas of expertise, and would enhance a lot of your efforts potentially if understanding how the brain works and how information is processed, being able to really take full advantage of that. Because we've, in the last few decades, have come leaps and bounds in understanding how the brain processes information. And that's relevant for artists as well, as they try to communicate visually or interactively to audiences. We know that visual communication is incredibly poignant for people in that moment to have that experience. And that is something that has really been underutilized when we think about communicating science and relevant information that's going to help individuals, communities, and onwards from there to make better decisions for themselves. So I'll give some background, and then we will get into how it's relevant for communication and how it's relevant to those that are in more creative crafts. Okay, so behavioral science, it's a cross-disciplinary science, and the purpose of it is to understand what are the causes behind individual, group, and organizational behavior across all levels. So not just individual decision making, but all the way to global governance. So that's where the discipline comes in. And it encompasses a lot of different fields, social sciences primarily. It brings in insights across a variety of disciplines that include behavioral economics, organizational behavior, neuroscience, social cognitive psychology. And under this umbrella of behavioral science, and none of these disciplines on their own can really give you the full picture, but behavioral science gives a comprehensive understanding as to why humans behave the way that they do and how these behaviors are actually linked to perceptions. It's really what's in people's brains, and it's how they perceive the stimulus of the environment that they're operating in and the world around them. That is explains so much more about decision making and behavioral outcomes than anything else. We try really hard, and Joe, I'm sure, has talked about this. We try to communicate science, but ultimately it comes down to, is it really the information that's being communicated, or is it how it's being interpreted and processed at that individual decision-making level? And that's what behavioral science looks to understand. So we have to understand why this is the case. It's because this is how our brain is wired. Since the dawn of our species, our brains have been designed to react in certain ways to the risks that are around us. And we tend to overreact. We've found this to be systematically true. We overreact to different risks that are considered novel or unfamiliar or have the potential for catastrophic consequences. And that's worked out, because if you think of our ancestors crossing paths with a snake or a tiger, the immediate response, which we call system one, or that fight or flight response, to process the risk and to move to jump and react and run away, that resulted in that ancestor of ours surviving. We're probably not related to our ancestors who didn't process risks that quickly and who didn't run away when they found themselves face to face with the tiger, right? We're not related to them. Our brains haven't changed so much from then, but the complex risk landscape that we are living in and operating now has changed rapidly. So we have to recognize that. We have to recognize the limitations of our brain and how cognitive processing is still very much wired to that. If something is immediate in front of us, we care. We're probably even overreacting to it. And if something is less obvious or seemingly slow moving, far away, or invisible, COVID-19 is a great example. It's an invisible risk until it's not. These are the things that make people complacent. These are the things that we don't respond to quickly and fast enough. And then it's not until that these types of risks actually emerge that we see people panic and move to action. But we really don't have the luxury of doing that anymore, because a lot of these risks are now occurring in more frequency and intensity. And you can see how simultaneous impacts of climate change, which I consider COVID-19 to be a ripple effect of climate change, as these are occurring more frequently, we have to address our limitations. It was fine for the thousands of years, but now we're at a point where we just can't afford the luxury of ignoring very real risks just because they don't register on our scale of being immediate and relevant. And the one thing I want to make sure that's clear is that none of us are immune to this. I did my PhD in this. You would think I would be the person that would nail the risk on the head. What is it that we should be worried about? If anyone should know, it's me. No, I'm not immune to this. Risk scientists are not immune to this. We all fall prey to our innate biases. And it's really, that's what we have to remember, is that this is really hardwired in us. Let me ask you guys a question. Feel free to jump in. Who do you think out of all professions is probably the most aware of the risks that they actually face? And that's a term we refer to as calibration. How well calibrated are people? So generally people aren't. We overreact to risks that we shouldn't care about. We underreact to risks like testing our home for radon gas, proactively preparing for heart disease, the things that really kill in the hundreds of thousands of Americans. Specifically, if we're gonna give an example, I'll talk about the US. So the things that really hurt and impact us, we aren't actually referring to accurately. That means we're not well calibrated in our risk register, but there's some professions that are better calibrated than others. Can you guys think of a profession that would be very well calibrated because their very profession and their survival depends on it? What do you think? No pressure. If anyone has an idea, go for it.
Fire department.
Which one?
Fire department.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Yeah, because that's the kind of thing where it's life or death, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You need to be well calibrated to the reality of the risk that we're facing. That's a good one.
Construction, maybe? I don't know.
You're on the right track. That's exactly right. The idea is that those whose livelihoods depend on getting risk right have to be better attuned to it. But even they aren't immune. And the one I'm going to say, so the number one profession that actually does a really good job at this, and I'm sure you're going to be like, no way, because they never get it right. But that's the irony of it, is that truly nobody is immune. The department that does a really good job, or the profession that does a really good job, are meteorologists. So weathermen and women, because as you can imagine, they're looking at historic data, they're having to think forward to future data, and they're having to tell you what weather to expect the next day. And if they get it wrong, they get abuse. Think of how many people are like, my weather person didn't say it was going to rain today, and it rains. Like, you can't get away with not getting the weather right. So you're really attuned to the base rate statistics underlying the probability of a particular weather event occurring the next day or that week. And even still, think about how many times we've been upset with our weathermen and women for getting the weather wrong. So it just goes to show just how tricky it is to overcome those innate biases of not being able to accurately predict, because we are unfortunately triggered by factors that don't and shouldn't play into our decision making, but they really do. And that is what I want to make sure, if you don't take away anything else from this, you remember that none of us are immune, and we get it really wrong. And if there's a graph you could share, I believe I sent it to Maggie, the first of the slides. Yeah, this is an example. It's a visual illustration of our perceptions versus actual risk. And this doesn't exactly portray the relative proportions of annual deaths in America, but it gives you an idea. So there's public outrage versus the actual risk. So we have outrage around things like plane crashes and 5G. Who even knows what 5G is? I don't know. Like, I haven't really gotten into it, but it's not like, what is 5G? GMOs, swine flu. These are things we really have overreacted to, versus if you look at the bubbles to compare to the actual risk, it's not. It's an example of overreaction. Then there's these risks that we really underreact to. Again, I did these bubbles for the purpose of just showing the vast discrepancy between our perceptions and reality. People really underreact to heat. Heat is a major killer, and it's increasing, especially as the planet is warming. Radon gas is the second biggest contributor to lung cancer. Nobody talks about that. I mean, we talk about cigarettes. We don't talk about radon gas. Does anyone even know if they should be testing their home for radon gas? I mean, it's actually wild if you think about the things that really kill Americans annually. Alzheimer's, heart disease, these are the biggest killers, but we don't perceive them as major threats. And the reason is because of all of what I've been describing. We overestimate risks that aren't actually that serious, like getting vaccinated. And we underestimate risks for the potential, let's say like COVID-19. We underestimate, before COVID-19 actually broke out, the potential for a disease to break out and to ground our lives to a screeching halt. We weren't worried about that. If we were worried about that, COVID-19 wouldn't have happened in the way that it did. And we think the reason is because we have this, what we call as optimism bias. So we think it's not going to happen to us. This is going to be something that other people deal with over there. Again, it's not going to, we just think we're immune to this stuff. And that over-programming to be overconfident is why we find ourselves in these situations where it's very clear that we're underprepared. And so COVID-19, I was telling Kiki I was going to talk a little bit about COVID to make it relevant. And again, I'd love for you all, from your vantage point where you're coming from, to think about how this stuff is relevant, and we can kind of brainstorm and explore some of this. But what people like to hear about, because it's current to the moment, is that COVID is a really good example of this. We're complacent when there isn't that outbreak. And then once COVID came out, what did we witness, right? Do you guys remember? It wasn't that long ago. It was like shelves being cleared of toilet paper, hand sanitizer, massive overreaction. And over time, though, that's not sustainable. People default back. It's our nature to default back. Recall and memory of even traumatic experiences, and without going into like PTSD, but recall of experiences are very short-lived. We go back to our innate wiring. And so what we're seeing now is this behavioral fatigue, and we've adapted to accommodate the new risk, which is now COVID-19 is kind of taking its place in the risk landscape the way the flu has done. Nobody's freaking out over the flu, even though it does kill tens of thousands of Americans a year. But because it's no longer unfamiliar, we are cognitively adapting to accommodate this new risk. And if that, I want to convince you that that's true, because do you think any more day to day, or did you ever about measles, swine flu, even HIV. Not that these aren't risks, but there was a point where we collectively didn't care about it in the way that we find ourselves caring about something that is new and emerging. It takes its place, and we basically become comfortable with it. And that's the nature of how our brains work. So basically, the takeaway from this is we need to make sure that the way we move forward is recognizing that we're going to default back to our status quo. And so we need to put some real action in place and across our expertise and our crafts and our silos, that we don't revert back to behavior where we continue to be complacent, because there could be nothing worse than more ripple effects of climate change, including another infectious disease outbreak that we've gotten comfortable with, and we are not proactively prepared for that to come out. So what are we going to do while this stuff is still relevant, while it's still in the media, to prevent that from happening so we don't get complacent? A real critical part of this is trust. And the second takeaway, if you don't remember anything else, is the role of trust. Trust can account to up to 50% of variance in decision making. So the reason people choose to do something or not, up to 50% of that can be attributed to whether or not they trust, not just the message, but the person who's communicating that message. And we know from sociology that we allow so many things to influence whether or not we trust messaging that's coming through. Really based around our identities, even our political affiliation. You can tell from whether or not somebody is a conservative, identifies as a conservative or as a liberal, as to what they will believe around information versus not. And so that's really, for a lot of people, a challenging thing to recognize and come to terms with. But as a behavioral scientist, I see this as empowering. I think it's really good that we are able to, we know this information about the brain. We can't change the way we're wired. We're talking about like our hardwiring as human beings. So it's better that we actually know how we're wired, because based on that, we can be smarter about how we develop communications. We can talk about things related to climate, and we can visually prepare them through art and other mediums in a way that is actually going to recognize the flaws and the limitations we have as humans, overcome those, and actually get through to the point where we can actually come up with some solutions together. And so I wanted to make sure that that was very clear. And I had told Kiki I was going to talk about some of the takeaways related to COVID. So is that still relevant and interesting for this conversation? Would that be helpful? Oh, actually, before I do that, Maggie, could you go to the next slide? Okay, I'll make sure I cover this. So some of the additional things, so I talked about trust being a real variable in decision-making. Here are a few more, and this is not an exhaustive list by any chance, but our perception of risk is increased and decreased based on key factors that trigger whether or not we perceive something as scary versus something that we can ignore. And these factors are, again, not exhaustive, but how natural is it? If something comes across as natural, we're just like, okay, well, nothing I can do about it anyway. So you don't attribute the same amount of risk to it. Controllability, can we control it? Think about why you're more scared to get on a plane than you are to drive a car. It's way safer to be on an airplane than it is to drive a car. But the fact that you're not actually controlling the airplane itself makes you feel that there's more risk associated with being on a plane than to drive your own car. That's an example. And there's real world examples of this, when after September 11th, more people chose to drive than to get on a plane because of September 11th being an incredibly salient example of why people are scared to fly. But then we had something like 40,000 more deaths than we would have had otherwise following September 11th because more people drove their cars. So controllability is a real factor behind how we process risk and how we ultimately make decisions. How much knowledge we know about it, scientific knowledge. So if we're familiar with something, we're more likely to just kind of, just have it become part of the many risks that we engage with on a day-to-day. But if it's something new, like a new technology, like genetically modified organisms, or like salmon, genetically modified salmon more specifically, or genetically modified mosquitoes, like all of these things are unfamiliar. It's new biotech advances. And so for that reason, we actually prescribe more risk to it than would otherwise be the case. And a lot of the other products that come out of science may just be a variation of existing technology, so we don't react to it in the same way. Familiarity, how familiar are we with a particular Risk will determine how scared we really are. How voluntary is exposure? Same thing. Are we controlling being in a? We're controlling being in a car. We're choosing to, but we're not. We are in the hands of the pilot when we're on the plane. So it's not. We don't have that voluntary control in the same way. So that plays a big role. How catastrophic could this be? It's why we think of like volcano eruptions, even though they're really rare. That's why they're so salient and they can wipe out villages. So we prescribe a lot more risk to something like that. How severe are the consequences? How immediate are the consequences? Who's affected? And is it something that's equitably distributed, or are certain populations more vulnerable than others? So we care a lot more about inequity in terms of those affected, which is a good thing. And we also attribute risk much higher to risks that impact the elderly and the young. That's something we all have universally in common. We want to protect our young, we want to protect our elderly. And so if there is a risk that seems to be disproportionately affecting more vulnerable communities, we prescribe more risk to it, which is why also with COVID-19, and I have a longer paper on this if anyone's interested, why we prescribe more risk. I deserve the risk, but why we even perceived higher risk, because it was disproportionately affecting the elderly. So there was a real fear around that. And if you can imagine, if this was a disease that broke out that was killing 5-year-olds or younger, imagine what the response and the reaction to that would have been. So this is how we're conditioned. Okay, I realize I've gone, I thought I had, wait, I didn't think I had this much material, sorry. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up. I'm gonna get to, so we have time for questions. I'm gonna get to how all of this, what does this all mean for communication? This is how our brain works. This is how we process risk. So when we think about telling a story, when we think about how us as visual artists or entertainers or whatever your craft is, whatever type of creative you are, how can you use what we know about the brain and how the brain processes information in a way that most effectively communicates, and that your end recipient, this is another key takeaway, your end recipient needs to interpret what you are intending. And that doesn't happen. Communications, visual communications especially, don't get interpreted as the communicator is hoping for it to be interpreted. We can put tons of stuff out there, but if it's not being processed in a way as you hope for, then what was the point? The best case scenario is it just doesn't get processed. Worst case scenario is that people respond to it in a hostile way or counter to what you were hoping. So it's our responsibility as those who are communicating, whatever the medium, to ensure that it's being interpreted as intended. And so here's things to remember. These are the kind of the communication, and there's a lot of best communication practices. There's a lot of ways to really design and effectively communicate. But the real key thing to remember as you're communicating and as you're using your particular craft to send messages is that people want to know the truth, even if it's worrisome. We have a lot of limitations, but we are doing a disservice to ourselves if we suggest that we can't handle the truth. We absolutely can, but people can only absorb a limited amount of information at a time. You don't want to overwhelm them. You want to bring them on a journey so that they are able to process and then move forward and process. Otherwise, we immobilize, we turn off. People don't necessarily understand cumulative risk, and they fall prey to the innate biases, the ones that I've been talking about through this whole thing, like whether something's familiar or whether something's salient or whether something is affecting vulnerable communities. We fall prey to that across the board, universally. Emotions also have a significant role to play, but we know how emotions impact decision-making in predictable ways. Even the most experienced communicators can't predict how messages will be interpreted. So even when you get to the point where you are kicking butt in presenting and communicating, if it's a new audience especially, don't just make the assumption that people are going to interpret you as you intend. Always test, always make the point to understand what people's innate perceptions are before making the effort to try and adjust for any misconceptions or erroneous beliefs that they might have. We also, as communicators, tend to exaggerate our ability to predict people's behavior. We're all human. We all fall prey to our own biases, and we all are more optimistic. We think we do things better than other people. Even the most insecure people will think that they are better than other people at certain things. It's fascinating. It's something to remember. And people, ultimately, the positive that I would like us to take away is that people do make sensible decisions. It's not all bad. The beauty is that we know what our cognitive limitations are, And we can overcome them if we confront our innate biases. And as a communicator, just give people relevant, accurate, timely, credible information, again, through whatever medium, and they will get it. They will be able to absorb it. That's what we've learned, is that it's a matter of being patient, recognizing how the brain works, recognizing the limitations, and creating communications around it in a way that you can really have long-lasting positive impact and behavioral change. Ultimately, if the goal is having people make better decisions and predict their behavioral outcomes, this is the way to do it. Recognize perceptions, recognize the biases, develop communications in a custom-tailored way, and deliver them in all the ways that I just described, so people are able to really take what you're giving them and make good decisions based on it. So I hope that was helpful. It's very general behavioral science and communication science that I think could be very helpful for those who are trying to be most effective in communicating, especially through visual means. Okay, I'll leave it there.